What happened to my audio book?
To mention the mass executions of undesirable elements by the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units also stiffened the resolve of the Soviet people. In response to the frequent cruelty, massacres, and wanton destruction and plundering of property, units of partisans sprang up across the countryside. Initially, the partisans' effect was limited, but later in the war they were to create havoc behind enemy lines. The Red Army fights back. After the initial shock of the invasion, Soviet forces regrouped and reconsolidated. Reinforcements were called up, increasing the number of divisions from 170 to 212, albeit with only 90 at full strength, while reserve artillery regiments were created and moved to key points on the front. Soviet officers and generals gained experience and effectiveness at fighting the invaders. In particular, the Red Army mounted fierce resistance in Ukraine, where Germany's Army Group South fell behind schedule. However, the invasion force began to break through from the middle of July and was joined by contingents from Romania and Italy. On the 15th of September, German forces trapped 650,000 Soviet soldiers around Kiev, the largest encirclement in military history. 5 days later, the Soviet commander, General Mikhail Kurpanos, was killed by a landmine. This led to a Soviet collapse in the area, allowing German forces to capture Kiev and more than 400,000 Red Army soldiers. The Germans advanced further south and east into Ukraine, taking much of the industrial region of Donbass. On the 21st of November, the port city of Rostov-on-Don was captured, leaving Germany poised to advance into the oil fields of the Caucasus. However, 6 days later, the Red Army counterattacked, forcing the Germans to abandon Rostov-on-Don on the 29th of November, their first major withdrawal of Operation Barbarossa. Meanwhile, Army Group North had secured the Baltic states and reached the outskirts of Leningrad by the 8th of September. Rather than storm the city, Hitler ordered his armies to bombard it and try to starve it out, beginning a siege that would last 872 days. Army Group Center had made little progress since capturing Smolensk, due to supply issues and diversion of its panzers to assist the other battle groups, delaying the attack on Moscow. Fighting for Moscow. On the 6th of September 1941, Hitler issued Foreign Directive number 35 for an Operation Typhoon would concentrate the bulk of the panzer forces on Army Group Center and use them to penetrate Moscow's defenses. However, autumn rains brought the Rasputitsa, Sea of Mud season, making the already pass. This gave Stalin and his leading general, Georgy Zhukov, time to organize the defenses of Moscow and call up reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East. Operation Typhoon began on the 30th of September. At first, German forces made steady advances, capturing 700,000 Soviet soldiers in 3 weeks. By the 19th of October, Moscow was under threat, and the Germans had closed to within 25 kilometers, 15 miles of the city, eclipsing the famous cupolas of St. Basil's Cathedral. Germany believed the Red Army would collapse, but the Soviets fought on, launching counterattacks that prevented the fall of Moscow. By early November, it was clear to the German Army High Command that they would not be able to take Moscow, or indeed defeat the USSR in 1941. The goal of Operation Barbarossa, to win a quick, decisive victory, had failed. Counterattack. Stalin, who had remained in Moscow, even appearing at the annual October Revolution Day celebrations in Red Square, now had a chance to strike back. He had 9 reserve armies that, unlike the Germans, were well prepared for fighting in the cold. Freezing conditions also disrupted Luftwaffe operations, denying the Germans aerial superiority. On the 6th of December 1941, the Soviet counterattack, led by Zhukov, was launched. Red Army soldiers, many clad in white to camouflage against the snow, struck hard. Hitler refused to countenance retreat, ordering his armies to stand fast and defend their positions at all costs. This went against the advice of his generals, who proposed a tactical retreat to consolidate their lines. Hitler's response was to dismiss Walter von Brauchtisch, commander-in-chief of the German army, and take the position himself. Any generals who went against Hitler who was now in personal charge of the armed forces, faced dismissal and replacement. The war drags on. By the end of December, German units had been forced between 80 and 240 kilometers, 50 and 150 miles from Moscow, ending the immediate threat to the city. Hitler ordered his soldiers to dig in and construct hedgehogs, defensive strongpoints that would be highly costly to capture. But due to the cold, his engineers had to use explosives to blast the frozen solid earth. As 1942 dawned, the rapid movement that had characterized the initial phase of Operation Barbarossa was a distant memory. Almost 1 million German soldiers had been killed or wounded, while the Red Army had suffered around 1 million deaths, 3 million wounded, and 3.3 million captured. It was clear that fighting on the Eastern Front would continue for months or even years, and take a heavy toll on the militaries of both sides, and on the civilian population of the USSR. In context. Focus: military invasion. Before 1939, the USSR and Germany pledged non-aggression through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. 1939, Germany, then the USSR, invade Poland in September, jointly occupying and dividing its territory. June to July 1940, the USSR invades the Baltic states, then Romania's Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. After January to April 1942, a series of Red Army counterattacks Axis, but secure the Soviet position. June 1942, Axis forces launch Case Blue, a two-pronged attack on Baku and Stalingrad. 23rd of August 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad begins. Hitler's reasons for invading the USSR. The Aryan belief that the Slavic peoples are racially inferior to the Germans. The view that defeating the USSR will persuade Britain to surrender. The USSR's economic assets, oil reserves, and agricultural output should be seized for Germany. The USSR's vast territories are considered a potential source of Lebensraum for German settlers in the East. The Nazis' ideological opposition to communism due to the perceived threat to social order. We are now directing our gaze at the lands in the East. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. We need only kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Adolf Hitler. German infantry marched past a bombed house as they crossed into the USSR in 1941. Shelling of Soviet targets combined with aerial attacks heralded the beginning of the German invasion. Axis invasion forces in Operation Barbarossa. The Axis invasion force for Operation Barbarossa was the largest yet seen in World War II. Around 80% of the German army was involved in the invasion. 3.5 million troops, 600,000 horses, 7,000 artillery pieces, 3,400 tanks, 2,700 aircraft. Buildings burned in Smolensk after Germany's Army Group Center captured the city in mid-July. The Red Army suffered heavy losses, but constantly harried German forces. Red Army troops captured by German forces were treated much more harshly than their Allied counterparts, and more than half did not survive. German troops crossed the River Bug near Warsaw, entering Soviet territory, seized by the USSR from Poland in September 1939, on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941. German forces maneuvered to trap the Red Army during the Battle of Kiev. By mid-September, panzers of Army Group South met those of Army Group Center, completing the encirclement. The Siege of Leningrad. Emblematic of the sacrifice of the Soviet people was the plight of the citizens of Leningrad. As German forces closed in on the city in September 1941, hundreds of thousands of its residents dug 550 kilometers, 340 miles of anti-tank ditches and 2,600 kilometers, 1,600 miles of trenches. This helped prevent the Germans from storming the city. Instead, they surrounded it and tried to starve its occupants. When the siege began on the 8th of September, Leningrad had a population of 2.6 million. There was only enough food to last for 1 month. Over time, people resorted to eating wallpaper paste, as well as horses, cats and dogs. Leningrad faced near constant bombardment. In total, German forces rained 150,000 artillery shells and 104,600 bombs on the city. On the 18th of January 1943, the blockade was broken, allowing supplies to be brought to the city. However, the siege was not fully lifted until the Red Army arrived on the 27th of January 1944. The official death toll was 632,000, but may have been up to 1 million. Civilians sought refuge in the ruins of the city of Leningrad. The inhabitants held out for more than 2 years against starvation and almost continual shelling. Nazi propaganda showed a German sledge convoy advancing in Soviet territory during Operation Barbarossa. In reality, the harsh Russian winter severely disrupted Hitler's plans. Despite its initial success in overwhelming Soviet defenses, Germany's progress was hindered by the vast distances involved, the harsh winter, and the USSR's huge reserves of men. Ultimately, the Red Army succeeded in preventing the Nazis from reaching Moscow. Joseph Stalin. Born in 1878 in modern-day Georgia, then ruled by Russia, Joseph Stalin became involved in revolutionary communist politics in his early 20s. After the 1917 Russian revolutions, Stalin became one of the leading figures in Lenin's communist government. After Lenin died in 1924, Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals, creating a totalitarian regime that consolidated power entirely on himself. Under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet system was forced into centralizing economic reforms and industrialization, which caused the 1932-33 famines in which millions died. In 1936-38, his Great Purge involved the execution of around 700,000 internal enemies of communism and imprisonment of more than 1 million more. His regime's 1939 non-pact with Germany kept the USSR out of World War II with the shock of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Under Stalin's leadership, the USSR survived, and by the end of World War II was poised to establish hegemony over much of Central and Eastern Europe. By the time Stalin died in 1953, the USSR had become a nuclear superpower. The Great Patriotic War, 1941-5. During World War II, no nation's population people of the USSR. The country lost around 26.6 million people as a result of the conflict, more than 2/3 of them civilians. After Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Axis armies wreaked havoc as they invaded and then occupied great swathes of Soviet territory. Millions were killed by disease. In total, the Axis forces destroyed completely or partially 1,710 towns and cities, 70,000 villages, and 6 million houses, making more than 25 million citizens homeless. However, helped by the winter weather, which slowed the German advance, the USSR survived to force back the invaders. There was no widespread collapse of social order or halt to economic production. The Soviet people mobilized en masse to defeat fascism in what was named by Russia's communist leadership as the Great Patriotic War, moving the war effort east. Fighting Germany and the other Axis powers required a huge volume of munitions and vehicles, as well as supplies such as food and fuel. Manufacturing these became a major problem for the Soviet leadership. It was located in the European part of the USSR, which was either occupied by Germany or threatened with invasion. From June to December 1941, the USSR lost around 2/3 of its coal and iron output, over half of its steel production, and 40% of its farmland. As a result, the government had to find a way to relocate production of these vital materials east of the Ural Mountains, Soviet Asia, where it would be out of reach of attack. With the launch of the